You already know how this goes. You've watched the same show so many times you don't even need to look at the screen anymore. You know, the rhythm of the jokes, the pauses before the lines land, the exact moment a character glances at the camera or sighs before everything falls apart and then neatly comes back together. And still, here you are, late at night, thumb hovering over play, choosing Season 1, Episode 1, again. Your partner doesn't get it. Your kids think it's ancient. Even Netflix has stopped trying to recommend you anything new, like it's quietly accepted defeat. But here's the strange part. This isn't you being lazy, broken, or stuck in the past. And it's not just about comfort, either. There's a deeper reason your brain keeps pulling you back to the same stories, the same characters, the same emotional beats, and it's a reason most people never stop to question. We'll come back to that. You're not afraid of new things. That's the assumption everyone jumps to, and it sounds convincing on the surface. If you keep rewatching the same shows, the same movies, the same comfort stories, people assume you've stopped growing, that you've checked out, that you'd rather hide in the past than deal with anything unfamiliar. But that reading misses something important. Think about it. You try new restaurants. You update your phone. You adapt to new systems at work, new expectations, new rules that didn't exist 5 years ago. Your life is already full of novelty, pressure, and change. So when you sit down at the end of the day and choose something familiar, that's not avoidance. That's calibration. Your brain isn't rejecting the new, it's recovering from it. And that distinction matters more than we like to admit, because it reframes rewatching from a personal flaw into a quiet, intelligent response to a world that keeps asking more from you than it used to. Your brain is wired to prefer what it already knows, especially when everything else feels uncertain. Psychologists call this the mere exposure effect, but the name doesn't do it justice. The more familiar something becomes, the safer it feels, and the safer it feels, the more your brain relaxes around it. When you rewatch a show you've already seen, your mind isn't scanning for threats or surprises. It's not working overtime to predict outcomes or decode new characters. It knows where this story is going, and that certainty matters more than entertainment value ever could. In a world that constantly demands attention, reaction, and judgment, familiarity is a shortcut to calm. You're not chasing plot twists. You're choosing predictability in a landscape that rarely offers it. And while that might sound small, it's not. Because predictability is one of the few things the human brain interprets as safety. But here's where it gets interesting. That sense of safety isn't just mental, it's emotional. And once that door opens, something deeper starts to happen. When you press play on a comfort show, you're not just watching something familiar. You're stepping into an emotional shelter your brain already trusts. You're not waiting to be impressed or surprised. You're letting your nervous system exhale. The tone is familiar. The stakes are known. The conflicts will rise, peak, and resolve in ways your body has already rehearsed. Nothing bad is going to blindside you here, and in a world that feels louder, faster, and more demanding every year, that predictability becomes a form of quiet relief. This is why rewatching doesn't feel boring. It feels grounding. While new content puts your brain into constant evaluation mode, who is this? Do I like them? Where is this going? Rewatching does the opposite. It lowers the volume. It smooths the edges. It gives your mind permission to stop performing and simply exist for a while. And once that happens, once your guard is down, something subtle but powerful takes over. Because you're not just returning to the story, you're returning to the version of yourself who first felt safe inside it. This is the part people rarely notice, because it's quieter than comfort and deeper than nostalgia. You're not experiencing the same story twice, even though it looks that way on the surface. The episode hasn't changed, but you have. The first time you watched it, you were in a different place in your life, carrying different worries, different hopes, different blind spots. Back then, maybe you saw yourself in the dreamer, the rebel, the one trying to escape responsibility. Years later, you notice the parent, the leader, the character who's tired but still showing up. The story stays still so you can see how much you've moved. That's why certain scenes hit harder now, why jokes land differently, why moments you once skipped suddenly feel heavy. It's not repetition, it's contrast. Each rewatch quietly measures the distance between who you were and who you are now. And without saying it out loud, your brain registers that growth. But there's another layer underneath that, one that has less to do with you alone and more to do with the people who used to exist beside you when these stories first mattered. Because these shows aren't just stories, they're time capsules. They carry the weight of when and who you were with when you first watched them. Maybe it was a Thursday night ritual with your sister, back when you had to be home at a specific time because streaming wasn't a thing yet. Maybe it was a roommate phase, when the apartment was too small, the future felt wide open, and everything important happened on a couch that smelled like takeout. Maybe it was a parent who introduced you to a movie they loved, not knowing it would become one of the few ways you'd feel close to them later on. When you rewatch, you're not just revisiting a plot. You're revisiting a version of your life that no longer exists. And sometimes that's comforting. Sometimes it's bittersweet. Sometimes it's grief disguised as familiarity. But either way, your brain understands something your words don't always catch up to. This story holds people, moments, and feelings you don't want to lose. And that's where the tone shifts. Because beneath all that warmth, there's a quieter truth most people avoid naming. Here's the part that might feel a little uncomfortable. Not because it's wrong, but because it's honest. Sometimes you're not rewatching because you love the show. Sometimes you're rewatching because it's the last place in your life where nothing is demanded of you. No performance, no growth, no improvement, no decision about who you're supposed to become next. Inside these familiar stories, you don't have to be productive, impressive, or emotionally available. You're allowed to just exist. And that's not weakness. That's relief. In a world that constantly asks you to optimize, upgrade, and explain yourself, familiarity becomes a rare space where your worth isn't questioned. Nothing needs to be fixed here. Nothing needs to move forward. And while that safety is real and valid, it quietly explains why your brain keeps reaching for the same stories when everything else feels like too much. Which brings us back to something very practical and very human that plays a bigger role than most people realize. By the time you sit down to watch something, your brain is already exhausted from choosing. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, cumulative way. You've made thousands of small decisions all day long: what to answer, what to ignore, what tone to use, what version of yourself to bring into each conversation. Choosing a new show doesn't feel neutral after that. It feels risky. What if it's bad? What if it takes 3 episodes to get good, and you don't have the energy to wait? What if everyone loves it and you don't, and now you're stuck questioning your own taste? Rewatching removes all of that. It's a guaranteed yes. No learning curve. No disappointment. No mental overhead. Your brain recognizes this as efficiency, not avoidance. It's conserving energy the same way it does when it takes a familiar route home instead of experimenting with a new one. And once that choice is made, something even deeper clicks into place. Something we hinted at earlier but haven't named yet. This is the reason we left open at the beginning. The one that sits underneath comfort, efficiency, and nostalgia. Sometimes you're not rewatching the show itself. You're rewatching the version of yourself that felt safe when that show first mattered. Back then, your life may have been smaller, simpler, or at least more predictable. You hadn't lost certain people yet. Certain pressures hadn't arrived. Certain responsibilities hadn't settled into your chest and decided to stay. When you return to these familiar stories, your brain isn't trying to go backward in time. It's trying to briefly remember what stability felt like. Not because you can't handle your life now, but because the present asks more of you than the past ever did. Rewatching becomes a way to touch something steady, something known, something that once held you together. And when you look at it that way, the habit stops looking like escapism and starts looking like self-preservation. Which brings us to the final thought, the one that reframes everything you've been feeling without taking anything away from it. Comfort shows aren't a crutch, they're a quiet anchor. They don't pull you backward, and they don't stop you from growing. They hold you steady while everything else keeps shifting. There's nothing wrong with exploring new stories, new ideas, new versions of yourself. But there's also nothing weak about returning to the ones that shaped you, the ones that still know how to reach you without asking for anything in return. Your comfort show isn't about hiding from life. It's about remembering who you were before life got so loud. And sometimes, that reminder is exactly what gives you enough stability to step forward again. So the next time someone questions why you're watching the same thing for the 10th, 15th, 19th time, you don't need to explain it. Your brain already knows why. And honestly, that's enough.